It started with a distance I couldn't explain. My wife, Hannah, had always been good at keeping her composure, even when life was chaotic. But this was different. The warmth in her voice had dimmed. Her laughter felt forced, and her presence in the house was more like a shadow than the person I married years ago. I told myself it was work. She'd been taking on more cases at the clinic lately, staying later, and coming home exhausted. I wanted to believe that, but then there were the other things. Her phone, always tucked away or face down on the counter. The hushed tones when she'd take a call, walking out of the room without explanation. The faint smell of cologne clinging to her clothes some nights. Not hers, not mine, but someone else's. Every time I noticed, I told myself not to be ridiculous. She wasn't the type. What couple didn't after a decade together? But I thought we were solid enough. And then there was me. I wasn't blameless in all this. I'd been seeing a therapist, Dr. Morgan, for months without telling her. I'd gone to him because I felt stuck in our marriage. I didn't want to burden Hannah with my doubts, my frustrations. Dr. Morgan had this calm, commanding presence that made me feel like I could say anything, lay it all bare. And he wouldn't judge. I told him about everything, about how Hannah seemed so distant, about how I felt like I was failing her, failing us. He'd always listen, nodding thoughtfully, offering quiet insights that felt like stepping stones out of my mess. But as the weeks went on, I noticed something strange. Whenever I'd talk about Hannah, her long hours, her sudden withdrawal, Dr. Morgan would shift ever so slightly in his seat. His questions became more pointed. Does she know how you feel? Does she talk about work much? It didn't strike me as odd at the time. He was my therapist. Of course, he wanted me to dig deeper. I didn't realize he was already digging too. The truth hit me like a sledgehammer one Saturday afternoon. Hannah had left her laptop open on the dining table. I wasn't snooping. I swear I wasn't. I was just walking by when I saw her email inbox on the screen, and something caught my eye. A message at the top from a name I knew too well, Dr. Thomas Morgan. I don't know what made me stop. Maybe it was the subject line, thinking of you. Or maybe it was the timestamp, sent late last night, after she'd come home from working late. My pulse was deafening in my ears as I clicked on it. It was short, but it didn't need to be long. Every word hit like a knife. I can't get you out of my head. Last night was incredible. I know this is dangerous, but I don't care. You mean too much to me. For a second, I couldn't breathe. The words blurred together on the screen as my mind raced to make sense of what I was seeing. Last night, while I was at home, waiting for her to come through the door with that tired smile she was with him, my therapist, the man I'd trusted with my deepest fears, my most vulnerable thoughts, the man I'd paid to help me save my marriage. I read the email 3 more times, hoping, praying that I was missing something, that there was some kind of innocent explanation. But deep down, I already knew. My wife was cheating on me, and not just with anyone, with the one person who knew exactly how broken I was. The irony was so cruel, it made me want to laugh. Or scream. Or both. When I finally managed to move, I closed the laptop and sat there, my hands trembling. I tried to piece together the timeline, but the details felt like quicksand. How long had this been going on? Had it started before I began therapy? Or did it happen because of it? Had Dr. Morgan been grooming me, waiting for the perfect moment to exploit what I shared? I felt sick. The betrayal wasn't just hers. It was his too. They'd both taken what little trust one had left and torn it to shreds. And the worst part? I couldn't even confront them yet. Not until I'd figured out what the hell I was going to do that I couldn't hold it in any longer. The email burned in my mind like a flashing neon sign, and no amount of denial could dim it. That night, when Hannah came home, I was waiting for her at the kitchen table. Her keys jingled in the lock, and the sound sent a fresh wave of adrenaline surging through me. She walked in like nothing was wrong, dropped her bag on the counter, kicked off her shoes, and headed to the fridge. "Hey," she said over her shoulder, grabbing a water bottle. "Did you eat yet?" I didn't answer. It wasn't until she turned around that she saw me sitting there, the laptop open in front of me. Her smile faltered. "What's wrong?" she asked. I slid the screen toward her, the email still open. "You tell me." Her face went pale as her eyes scanned the message. I saw the exact moment she realized she was caught. The way her lips parted, Her breath hitched. Her fingers hovered just above the edge of the table. "Do you want to explain this?" I asked, my voice low and steady. Too steady. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "Hannah," I said sharply, slamming my palm on the table. "Say something." Her eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Sorry," I repeated, my voice rising. "You're sorry. For what?" "Exactly. Sleeping with him, lying to me, or both." Her shoulders shook as the tears started falling, but I didn't feel sympathy. "Not this time. I didn't mean for this to happen," she said through her sobs. "It just had happened. I wasn't looking for it." "Bullshit," I snapped, standing up so fast my chair scraped against the floor. "You don't just accidentally fall into bed with someone, Hannah. Least of all my therapist, the guy I trusted to help us fix our marriage." "How long has this been going on?" She shook her head, her voice barely audible. "A few months," I repeated, stunned. "Jesus Christ, Hannah. Were you laughing at me the whole time?" Sitting in his office, pouring my heart out to him while you too. "No," she interrupted, her voice breaking. "It wasn't like that. I didn't plan it. I felt so alone. And he what?" I snapped. "He made you feel special. He understood you. Spare me." She crumpled into a chair, her head in her hands, but I couldn't look at her anymore. Every inch of me was shaking, my chest tight, my throat raw. I couldn't stay in that house for another second. I grabbed my coat and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" she asked, panic lacing her voice. "Out," I said coldly. "Don't wait up." And just like that, I left. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay. I didn't sleep that night. I drove aimlessly for hours, looping through streets I barely recognized, the city lights blurring past my windows. The image of that email played over and over in my mind, like a cruel movie reel I couldn't shut off. I kept hearing his name, Dr. Thomas Morgan. It sounded so clinical, so professional, so goddamn normal, but now it felt like a curse. At some point, I pulled into the parking lot of an all-night diner. I don't know why. Maybe because I needed to feel grounded, like I existed somewhere in the real world and not in the nightmare my life had become. I sat at the counter, ordered coffee I didn't drink, and stared at the steam rising from the mug. I wanted to be angry. Hell, I was angry. But beneath the anger was something worse, shame. Not just shame that Hannah had cheated on me, but shame that I'd helped her do it. I'd brought him into our lives. I'd trusted him. I'd let him into my head, told him things I hadn't even told her, thinking he was helping me. And the whole time, he was helping himself to my wife. How do you even begin to process something like that? The sun was rising by the time I made it back home. I parked in the driveway and sat there for a long moment, staring at the front door. I didn't want to go inside. I didn't want to face her, but I couldn't hide forever. When I finally walked in, the house was eerily quiet. Hannah was sitting on the couch, her knees drawn up to her chest, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked up as I stepped into the room, but I didn't say anything. I didn't even take off my coat. "I thought you weren't coming back," she said softly. "I wasn't sure I would," I replied, my voice cold and distant. She flinched like my words physically hurt her. Good. They were meant to. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. She looked like she wanted to say something, but I didn't care. I didn't want to hear her excuses, her justifications, her apologies. None of it would change what she'd done. Finally, she broke the silence. "I know you hate me right now," she said, her voice trembling. "And I don't blame you. But I need you to know, it wasn't about you. It wasn't because of anything you did or didn't do." I laughed bitterly. "Oh, so it's not my fault. That's a relief." Her eyes filled with fresh tears. "I'm not saying it to make excuses. I felt so lost, Jack. I felt lost for so long. And Thomas," she trailed off, as if even saying his name hurt. "He listened. He saw me in a way I didn't think anyone could anymore." "You mean he took advantage of you?" I snapped. "Don't dress this up like some romantic tragedy, Hannah. He's a fucking predator. He used his position to manipulate you, and you let him." Her face crumpled at that, and for a split second, I felt a pain of guilt. But then I remembered the email, the lies, the months of deceit. I pushed the guilt aside. She didn't deserve it. You think I don't know that, she cried. You think I don't wake up every day hating myself for what I've done. I know I crossed a line. I know I hurt you. But it wasn't just him. I let it happen. I wanted it to happen. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Why? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why would you do this to me? To us? She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't know, she said. I wish I did. I was angry and lonely and broken. And he made me feel wanted again. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. Invisible? I repeated, my voice rising. How the hell were you invisible, Hannah? I was right here. I've always been here. But we weren't us anymore, she said, her voice breaking. We were just existing. You stopped seeing me a long time ago, Jack. And I stopped trying to make you. Her words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. Part of me knew she was right. We hadn't been happy for a long time. But that didn't justify what she'd done. It didn't justify betraying me with him. I can't do this, I said, running a hand through my hair. I can't sit here and listen to you justify this like it was some inevitable consequence of us falling apart. I'm not justifying it, she said, her voice shaking. I'm just trying to explain. I don't want your explanations. I shouted, my voice echoing through the room. I don't want your excuses, or your guilt, or your fucking tears. I want to know how you fix something like this, Hannah, because I don't see how you can. Her sobs broke through then, raw and uncontrollable. She buried her face in her hands, and for a moment, I just stood there, watching her fall apart. But instead of feeling pity, all I felt was emptiness. I need space, I said finally. Her head shot up, her eyes wide with fear. Jack, please. Don't, I said, cutting her off. Don't beg me. Don't make this harder than it already is. I need to think. I need to figure out what the hell I'm supposed to do now. I turned and walked upstairs, closing the bedroom door behind me. I didn't know where we were headed, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if love was enough to save us. The next few days passed in a fog. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything but the gnawing ache in my chest. I stayed in the guest room, only emerging when Hannah wasn't around. I couldn't look at her without seeing him. The worst part was that I didn't know what to do. The betrayal felt too big, too overwhelming to process. Every time I tried to think about the future, about us, I hit a wall. I didn't know if I could forgive her, but I didn't know if I was ready to leave her either. What I did know was that I needed answers, which is how I found myself standing outside Dr. Morgan's office 2 days later. It felt surreal being there, like stepping into the ruins of a place I'd once thought was safe. I had spent months in that building, sitting on that worn leather couch, spilling my soul to a man I thought was there to help me. And now I was about to confront him about sleeping with my wife. I didn't have an appointment, obviously, but I didn't care. I walked up to the receptionist, my hands clenched in a fist at my sides. I need to see Dr. Morgan, I said, my voice flat. Do you have an appointment? She asked, glancing up at me with a polite smile. No, I said, but I'm not leaving until I talk to him. Something in my tone must have gotten through to her, because her smile faltered. She nodded and picked up the phone, murmuring something I didn't hear. A few moments later, she gestured toward the hallway. He can see you now. I walked down the familiar corridor, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached his door, I didn't knock, I just opened it and stepped inside. He was sitting at his desk, looking as calm and collected as ever. That same steady, professional demeanor that had once put me at ease now made my skin crawl. Jack, he said, standing up, this is unexpected. Sit down, I said, my voice tight. His eyebrows raised, but he sat, folding his hands on the desk in front of him. What's going on? You know exactly what's going on, I said, slamming the door shut behind me. Don't play dumb. I know about you and Hannah. For the first time, his expression faltered. His eyes flickered to the side, his jaw tightening. Jack, save it, I snapped. I don't want your excuses. I want the truth. How long has this been going on? He hesitated, and for a moment, I thought he wasn't going to answer. But then he sighed and leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. A few months, he admitted. It started after one of her sessions. Her sessions. I repeated, my stomach churning. You mean to tell me my wife was seeing you too? And you didn't think that was something I needed to know? It was confidential, he said, as if that made it okay. She came to me on her own for help with personal issues. Don't you dare try to spin this like you were helping her, I growled. You're a goddamn therapist, Thomas. You knew exactly how vulnerable she was, and you took advantage of her. I didn't take advantage of her, he said firmly. It wasn't like that. We connected. We're human, Jack. These things happen. These things happen. I repeated, my voice rising. You don't get to brush this off like some accident. You're not just some guy, Thomas. You were my therapist. You knew everything about me, about my marriage, and you used that to get close to her. Do you even realize how sick that is? He didn't say anything, and the silence was deafening. You're a goddamn coward, I spat. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed your profession, your oath, everything you're supposed to stand for. And for what? Because you connected with her. I'm sorry, he said quietly, and the words felt like gasoline on a fire. Sorry. I snapped. You don't get to say that to me. You don't get to apologize and pretend like that fixes anything. You destroyed my marriage, my trust, everything. And you think sorry is enough. He looked down at his desk, avoiding my gaze. For a moment, I just stood there, my chest heaving, my fists clenched at my sides. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to hurt him as badly as he'd hurt me. But I knew it wouldn't change anything. I trusted you, I said finally, my voice cracking. I trusted you to help me, to help us. And you used that trust to fuck my wife. He flinched at my words, but I didn't care. He deserved worse. I don't know how you live with yourself, I said, shaking my head, but I hope it eats at you every day for the rest of your life. I turned and walked out of the office, slamming the door behind me. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit me like a slap in the face. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but it didn't help. For the first time in my life, I felt completely untethered, like everything I'd built had been ripped away from me. I didn't know where to go from here, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't go back to him. Or to her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. In the days that followed, I felt like I was living someone else's life. Nothing felt real. Hannah's betrayal, Thomas's actions, the crumbling wreckage of my marriage. I'd wake up in the guest room every morning with this brief, blissful moment where I forgot everything, and then reality would come crashing back in. I still couldn't talk to Hannah. Every time I looked at her, I saw his name flashing in my mind like a neon sign. Every time she tried to speak to me, I felt an anger rise in my chest so sharp it made it hard to breathe. She gave me space, but I could feel her watching me, waiting for me to say something, anything, but I didn't have the words. It wasn't just the betrayal itself that gutted me. It was what it represented. I'd spent years convincing myself that our problems were fixable, that the cracks in our marriage were just the result of time and stress and life piling on top of us. But this was different. This wasn't a crack, it was a chasm, and I didn't know if I had the strength or the will to try to bridge it. I couldn't stay in the house anymore. Every room felt suffocating, filled with memories that now felt like lies. I packed a bag one night while Hannah was asleep and left without saying anything. I found a cheap motel a few miles away, the kind of place with a flickering neon sign and a smell of mildew that seemed permanently baked into the walls. It wasn't much, but it was quiet. The first night, I sat on the bed with my head in my hands, replaying everything in my mind. The look on Hannah's face when I confronted her. The calm, detached way Thomas had tried to justify what he'd done. The email that had blown my life apart in just a few sentences. I felt like I was unraveling, like I was breaking apart piece by piece, and I didn't know how to stop it. That's when I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my brother. Mark and I hadn't been close for a while. Life had gotten in the way, jobs, marriages, the usual excuses. But he was the only person I could think of to call. When he picked up, groggy and confused, I felt a lump form in my throat. Jack, he said, his voice rough with sleep. It's late. Is everything okay? No, I said, my voice cracking. It's not. The silence on the other end was heavy, and then his voice softened. What happened? I told him everything. I didn't mean to, it just came spilling out, all the anger, the hurt, the betrayal. By the time I finished, I was shaking, tears streaming down my face. Jesus Christ, Mark said when I finally stopped. Jack, I don't even know what to say. Yeah, I said bitterly. You can't blame yourself for this, he said after a moment. This isn't on you. I brought him into our lives, I said. I trusted him. I told him everything, and he used it against me. Against us? That's not your fault, Mark said firmly. He's a goddamn professional. He's supposed to have boundaries. And Hannah, she made her own choices, Jack. This isn't on you. I didn't respond. I didn't know how to. Come stay with me, Mark said. I've got the space. You shouldn't be in some crappy motel right now, stewing in this. I hesitated. The idea of being around someone who actually cared about me was tempting, but I wasn't sure I could face another person just yet. I'll think about it, I said finally. All right, he said. But, Jack, don't shut yourself out completely. You're going to need people to get through this. I hung up after that, but his words stuck with me. I didn't want to need anyone. I wanted to handle this on my own, to prove to myself that I was strong enough to get through it. But deep down, I knew he was right. I couldn't keep running forever. 2 days later, I finally went back to the house. Not to stay, I still wasn't ready for that, but to talk to Hannah. When I walked through the door, she looked up from the couch, her eyes wide with surprise. You came back, she said softly. I'm not staying, I said quickly. I needed to talk. She nodded, sitting up straighter, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Okay. I sat down across from her, keeping the coffee table between us like a barrier. For a long moment, I didn't say anything. I didn't even know where to start. I don't know if we can fix this, I said finally. Her face crumpled, and she looked like she was about to cry again, but she held it together. I don't either, she admitted. I don't trust you, I said, my voice blunt. And I don't know if I ever will again. She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. I understand. I need time. I said, I don't know what that looks like yet, but I need space to figure it out. Take as much time as you need, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll wait for as long as it takes, Jack. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. I didn't respond. I didn't know if there was anything she could do to make it right. As I left the house again, I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, sadness, relief. I wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was starting to take control of my life again. Maybe we'd find our way back to each other. Or maybe this was the beginning of the end. Only time would tell.